A black, 11-year-old boy approached a millionaire in a diner and whispered 4 desperate words. The man, distracted by his newspaper, did not pay much attention until he saw the boy's tears. The decision he made then changed everything. Tommy stood inside the diner's entrance, holding the door open, just enough to slip through without drawing attention. The place smelled like coffee, bacon and cleaning products. The early morning light hit the window, near the corner booth, where a well-dressed man sat alone with a newspaper. Tommy noticed the man's expensive watch and neatly combed hair. A few other customers occupied booths, sipping coffee and picking at pancakes. The sound of utensils against plates, mixed with quiet conversations, and the low hum of the overhead lights. Tommy took small steps inside, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the room. He wore a plain red t-shirt that looked too big, and a pair of worn jeans. His shoes were old and scuffed. His stomach felt empty. He had not eaten since yesterday afternoon. He had no money, no backup plan. He only had one idea, and it stood right there at that table by the window. That man, Mr. Anderson, came here often. Tommy recognized him from previous mornings. Tommy had watched him read the newspaper and drink black coffee. The man's face was always serious, like he had nothing to worry about. Tommy knew he had money: the watch, the suit, the shoes. Everything suggested he had money. Tommy needed help, and this man was the only person who might be able to give it. Tommy moved toward a corner near the door. He tried not to bump into anyone. The counter was to his left, where the cook passed plates to a waitress with short, blonde hair. The waitress looked at Tommy but said nothing. She knew him. She had given him scraps before, sometimes a half-eaten piece of toast or leftover bacon. She never asked questions and he never explained. Today Tommy did not come just for scraps. He needed something bigger. He needed real help. His grandmother was at home in pain. No medicine left. He had no way to pay for more. He had tried saving money, but it was never enough. He had watched Mr. Anderson for days, waiting for the right moment. He wanted to speak right away, but his voice felt stuck. He worried that, if he just walked up and started talking, Mr. Anderson would tell him to go away. Tommy's hand shook. He took a seat at an empty booth, 3 tables away from the man. He tried to calm down. His heart beat fast. He thought about his grandmother's face that morning. She had struggled to get out of bed. He had given her some water and apologized for not having any medication. She only nodded and tried to hide how much it hurt. He remembered that moment clearly. He had to do something. Tommy looked down at the table in front of him. The surface felt sticky. He ran a finger along a small crack in the laminate. He turned his head slightly, checking if Anderson was still absorbed in his newspaper. He was. The man lifted his coffee cup, took a sip and turned to page. No one bothered him. He seemed important, like a person others respected or feared. Tommy needed to get his attention. But how? The waitress, who sometimes helped Tommy, approached his table. She did not sit, just leaned a bit closer and spoke softly. "You all right, kid?" she asked. Her voice was flat, but not unfriendly. Tommy shrugged. He swallowed hard. "I'm fine," he said too quietly. He looked away. He did not want her to know what he planned. She did not press him. She simply walked away to pick up more orders. He appreciated that she never asked too many questions. Tommy looked at Mr. Anderson again. He tried to imagine what to say. Should he say "excuse me" first? Should he talk about his grandmother's health right away or start softer? He was only 11, but he knew he had to sound as calm as possible. He doubted the man would listen if he started crying or speaking nonsense. Tommy wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He was not crying, but he felt close to it. There was no time for that. He had to be strong. Outside, cars passed along the street. The diner's large front window let in some light, but it was still early. The air inside was warm. Tommy could see a reflection of himself in the window. He looked tired. He had not slept well. He had nightmares again. He pushed those thoughts aside. He had to focus on right now. Nothing else mattered, except getting help for his grandmother. He got up from the booth and stepped toward Mr. Anderson's table. But halfway there he paused. He watched the man flip another page of the newspaper. Tommy's heart pounded. He wanted to turn around and leave. He did not want to embarrass himself or cause trouble. But he remembered his grandmother's face again. He remembered her quiet groans. He had no other choice. Tommy returned to his original spot near the door, pretending he was just moving around aimlessly. He did not want to look suspicious. He considered how he might speak. Maybe he should just say something simple and direct. He knew 4 words he wanted to say, if everything else failed. He had rehearsed them many times in his mind. "Help my family, please." Those 4 words were all he had. But he feared it would not be enough. Maybe he needed to introduce himself first. Explain that he lived with his grandmother, that they had no money left, that medicine cost too much. Would Anderson care about details? He glanced over at the cook. She was scraping burnt bits off the grill. She had her own problems. The waitress walked by again, refilling someone's coffee cup. The only open path to Mr. Anderson's table seemed to be a direct approach. Tommy noticed Mr. Anderson adjust his tie, then check his watch. The man seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Or maybe he was just finishing his morning routine. Tommy did not know. He had no way to guess what was in Mr. Anderson's mind. Tommy inhaled and exhaled slowly. The sound of a couple talking quietly at a nearby booth caught his ear. They sounded bored, discussing something about work. None of this mattered. Tommy needed to do what he came here to do. He stepped forward just 1 step, testing the ground. He felt the linoleum under his shoes. He took another step and another, slowly making his way closer to Mr. Anderson's table. He stopped a few feet away. The man did not look up. Tommy opened his mouth. But no words came out. He could hear his own breathing. He wanted to speak, but could not push the words past his throat. He retreated a few steps, heart sinking. Maybe he needed to approach from the side. If he stood at the table's corner, maybe Mr. Anderson would look up. Tommy circled around a small table, with salt and pepper shakers, carefully avoiding eye contact with other customers. He picked a spot near the man's table, not too close, not too far. He could see Mr. Anderson's face, now focused on some article. The man's eyes moved across the page. Tommy clenched his fists, then relaxed them. This would not get any easier if he waited. He had to just do it. He considered speaking the man's name, but he only knew it because he had heard the cook mention it once. "Mr. Anderson," she had said. "Your coffee is ready." Tommy hoped that was his name. It would be awkward if he was mistaken. He looked at the man's suit jacket, hanging on the back of the booth. He looked at the way the light shined on that gold watch. He looked at the man's clean fingernails, polished shoes. This person had everything Tommy did not. Tommy had nothing to lose by trying. He pressed his lips together and took one final deep breath. He had run out of time for doubts. He could not go home empty-handed. If he failed, his grandmother would suffer more. He stepped up to the man's table. His legs felt weak, but he stood straight. He cleared his throat softly, just loud enough to be noticed. He opened his mouth, ready to try speaking again. He felt a lump in his throat, but fought against it. He could at least say the man's name.
"Mr. Anderson."
"Mr. Anderson," Tommy's voice came out low and shaky. He waited, heart pounding. He saw Mr. Anderson's eyes flick up from the newspaper, for a second barely acknowledging him. The man frowned and returned to reading. Tommy's chest tightened. He had to try harder before he could speak again. He noticed a subtle shift in the diner's atmosphere. The waitress looked over concerned. The couple paused their conversation. No one said anything, but Tommy felt their eyes on him. Mr. Anderson still did not engage, still focused on the paper. Tommy swallowed hard. He was so close, but still invisible. He needed to be louder or more direct. He needed to push himself further. As the chapter ended, Tommy stood at Mr. Anderson's side, summoning the courage to speak again. He could not walk away now. He straightened his shoulders, preparing to try once more, determined not to give up. Tommy stood there stiff and quiet, with his shoulders drawn in. Mr. Anderson kept his eyes on the newspaper, tapping his finger against the table, as if counting seconds. Tommy opened his mouth again, trying not to look around at the other customers. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy said, his voice still low. He forced the words out. "I need to talk to you for a moment." Mr. Anderson raised his eyes just slightly, then lowered them back to the page. He pressed his lips together and turned another page, making a soft rustling sound. Tommy felt a sharp twist in his stomach. He had managed to speak, but it was not enough. He needed this man's attention, not just a glance. Tommy tried again. He stepped closer, staying to the side of the table, so he would not block the man's view. "Sir," he said, a bit louder this time, "can I please talk to you?" His voice cracked at the last word. He swallowed and tried to keep steady. He noticed the waitress watching from a distance, her face tense. The cook leaned forward behind the counter, gripping a spatula, eyes narrowed. Mr. Anderson lifted his gaze. This time, he held it on Tommy's face for more than a second. He looked annoyed. "What do you want, kid?" he said. His tone was flat, not friendly. He glanced at the clock on the wall, as if he had somewhere important to be. "I'm sorry to bother you," Tommy said, his knees feeling weak. "I really need help. He paused, looked down at the floor, and tried to study his breathing. "My grandmother is sick. We have no money for medicine. I do not know what else to do." His words came out in a strained whisper, but at least they came out. Mr. Anderson sighed and leaned back in the booth. He tapped his newspaper on the table. "Kid, I'm reading the paper. Go ask someone else." He did not even sound curious. He sounded bored and irritated. Tommy felt his chest tighten. He could hear a few quiet murmurs from other customers. He knew they were staring. The security guard, a heavy-set man in a dark uniform, started walking over. Tommy saw him from the corner of his eye. He had to say something before it was too late. "Please," Tommy said, trying to hold Mr. Anderson's gaze. "I'm not asking for much, just some help. My grandmother is in pain. I cannot pay for her medicine. I do not know what to do." His voice shook, and he pressed his palms against his jeans to keep them from trembling. The security guard arrived and stood to Tommy's left. The guard's presence felt heavy. "Is this kid bothering you, sir?" he asked, looking down at Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson lifted an eyebrow, looked at Tommy, then at the guard. He shrugged. "It's fine," he said in a dry tone. "Just give me a moment." He turned back to Tommy. "Look, I do not carry cash for random handouts. I suggest you leave me alone. This is not my problem." Tommy's heart sank. He knew this would be hard, but he did not expect such a cold response. He struggled to keep the tears back. He reminded himself that if he gave up now, his grandmother would continue to suffer. He could not leave without trying harder. "So," Tommy said, voice low but desperate, "I lost my parents 2 months ago. They died. I only have my grandmother now. She's very sick and I'm all she has. I'm asking for help because I've tried everything else." A heavy silence fell. Tommy's words came out too fast and shaky, but they were clear enough. He hoped this information would make the man listen. Tommy heard someone clear their throat across the diner. The security guard stood still, uncertain. The waitress slowly approached, holding a coffee pot, pretending to check on refills. The cook watched from behind the counter, her jaw Mr. Anderson put the newspaper down. He studied Tommy's face for a moment. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, but his voice lacked warmth still. "I do not know you. Why would I help you?" Tommy's eyes brimmed with tears, but he refused to let them fall yet. "Because I have no one else to ask," he said, his voice cracked again. "Because you can help. I see you here almost every day wearing nice clothes, reading the newspaper, and you always seem like someone who can do something. I'm just asking for medicine for my grandmother." The security guard shifted his weight, looking at Mr. Anderson. The man ran a hand over his chin, sighed and glanced around, as if looking for a way out of this conversation. The other customers tried not to stare openly, but Tommy could feel their attention. He heard the quiet clink of dishes. He smelled old coffee in the air. Time felt slow. Kidmer Anderson said, "Do you think I'm running a charity here?" He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. "You cannot just walk up to strangers and ask for help. That's not how the world works." Tommy's throat tightened. He felt the tears slip down his cheeks, now warm and unstoppable. He did not want to cry in front of everyone, but he could not control it anymore. "I know that," Tommy said, voice shaky. "I know it's not how things work. But what am I supposed to do? Should I just let my grandmother stay in pain? I have no money, I cannot get a job. I'm 11 years old." Mir Anderson placed the coffee cup down, a bit harder than necessary, making a dull thud. He narrowed his eyes. "You're 11, his voice softened slightly. Almost imperceptibly. "Where do you live?" Tommy hesitated. Should he give details? He glanced at the security guard, who looked less aggressive now. The waitress stood a few steps away, clutching the coffee pot with both hands, her knuckles turning white. "Near the park in the Bronx," Tommy said. "We live in a small apartment. My grandmother cannot walk well anymore. She's too weak." Mir Anderson said nothing for a moment. He tapped his fingertip on the table. Tommy saw something shift in the man's eyes, but he could not name it. Tommy forced himself to keep talking. "She needs medicine. I've been trying to save what little I have, but it's not enough. I already lost my parents. I cannot lose her too." The silence around them felt heavier now. The waitress took a step forward, hesitated, then spoke in a quiet voice. "He's telling the truth," she said. "The kid comes around sometimes. He never causes trouble, he's been struggling." Mir Anderson looked at her and frowned. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You know him?" He sounded suspicious. She shrugged. "I've seen him a few times," she said. "He's polite. He's quiet." She looked at Tommy. "He never asked me for money, just sometimes took leftover toast, or something like that." Tommy wiped his face with his sleeve. Feeling embarrassed, he wished the entire diner would stop watching him. He wanted this conversation to be over, but it had to end with some kind of help. He looked back at me Anderson, who seemed deep, and thought the security guard cleared his throat. "If the kid's telling the truth, maybe we should just let him talk," he said quietly. He did not sound angry anymore. Mir Anderson turned his attention to Tommy again. He spoke slowly, choosing words carefully. "I'm not a heartless person," he said, "but I do not know you. I have no reason to trust what you're saying. For all I know, you could be making this up to get money." Tommy felt a wave of panic. He shook his head. "I'm not lying," he said, voice firm despite his tears. "I swear my grandmother is sick. We cannot afford her pills. I do not want your money for myself. I just need help buying the medicine." The man pressed his lips into a thin line. He glanced at the clock again, then at the cook behind the counter, who now stood with arms folded watching. "Let me ask you something, kid," Mr. Anderson said. "Where's your grandmother?" "Right now," Tommy answered without hesitation. "She's at home, sir." he said. She's alone. I left her sleeping because I could not stand seeing her in pain without doing something. He looked down. I came straight here. I knew I'd find you here this morning. Mir Anderson's eyes narrowed. You've been watching me. Tommy nodded. He felt a spike of fear, worried that this would only make him look bad. Not in a weird way, he said quickly. I just knew you were always here, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper. I did not know where else to go. There was another long pause. The waitress shifted her weight, and the security guard took a small step back, giving them space. The other customers pretended to focus on their food, but the silence in the diner felt strained. Finally, Mir Anderson exhaled sharply. Fine, he said. Sit down for a moment. He gestured to the seat across from him. His tone was more neutral now. He did not sound friendly, but at least he was not telling Tommy to leave. Tommy slid into the booth across from the man. The vinyl seat felt cold through his jeans. Mir Anderson folded his newspaper and set it aside, then rested his arms on the table. He fixed Tommy with a steady look. If I were to believe you, what exactly do you need? Tommy's heart raced. This was progress. I need medicine, he said. It's pain medication. The doctor gave us a prescription, but we cannot refill it because we do not have the money. I need enough to help her through the next few weeks. His voice was quiet but steady. Now. Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, still studying Tommy's face, searching for any sign of dishonesty. Tommy met his eyes, trying to show he was sincere. He felt tired, but he would not give up. The waitress hovered nearby, silent. The security guard backed off completely, returning to his post. Mir Anderson said nothing yet. But the tension in the diner had changed. People were still watching, but now they seemed less hostile. Tommy waited, hands folded in his lap, hoping that this tiny bit of understanding would lead somewhere. Mr. Anderson kept his arms on the table, watching Tommy with an expression that was hard to read. Tommy shifted slightly in his seat, trying to ignore the way the waitress lingered nearby, pretending to wipe down a clean table. He felt the eyes of other customers, but he tried to focus only on the man in front of him. Do you know the name of the medicine? Mir Anderson asked. His tone was still flat, but at least he was asking questions now. Tommy nodded. It's a pain medication. The doctor prescribed it after she got worse last month. I have the prescription at home. He paused, worried that not having the paper on him might look suspicious. I can show you if you come with me. You can see for yourself. Mr. Anderson frowned. I'm not going to your house, kid. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. He took a moment to think. How much do you need? Tommy hesitated. He was not sure of the exact amount. He knew the medicine was expensive, because last time they bought it, his grandmother had used all the money left from his parents' pension. I'm not sure, he said quietly. I know it's more than I can afford. Maybe a few $100. Maybe more. I do not know the exact price. Mir Anderson said. He glanced at the waitress. She avoided his eyes and stepped back toward the counter. The cook pretended to be busy stacking plates, but kept glancing their way. The security guard had returned to his spot, near the door, one hand on his belt, ready to step in if something happened. This is all very strange, Mr. Anderson said. He lowered his voice. A kid asking me for money in a diner. I could just say no, I could ignore this. He paused, his gaze moving over Tommy's face. But you're here crying, talking about your grandmother. If you're lying, you're doing a pretty good job. I do not think you are, though. Tommy felt relief mixed with nervousness. His eyes still stung from tears, but he felt a bit more steady, now that Mir Anderson was at least considering the situation. He placed his hands flat on the table. I'm not lying, sir, he said, I promise. My grandmother's name is Martha. We live in a small apartment. She cannot work, she's old and sick. I lost my parents in a car accident 2 months ago. I've been trying to keep us both alive, with what little we have left. The money is gone. I do not know what else to do. That's why I'm here. Mir Anderson studied him in silence. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and he nodded slowly as if sorting through his thoughts. Outside, a truck drove by, its engine rumbling inside. A fork scraped a plate somewhere behind Tommy. The overhead lights buzzed softly. Tommy waited, not daring to say more until the man spoke again. After a long pause, Mir Anderson leaned forward. "If I help you," he said, "what guarantee do I have that you're not just going to take the money and run?" His voice was not harsh but direct. Tommy's throat felt dry. He swallowed and answered, "I do not know how to give you a guarantee. I'm just asking you to trust me. I'll show you where we live, where my grandmother is if you do not believe me. You can walk away. I cannot force you. I have nothing to offer as proof here and now." Mir Anderson tapped his fingers on the table. He looked frustrated. "This is not how I usually do things, kid. I'm a businessman, and I do not make decisions based on trust and tears. But I'm not a monster. I do not want to leave an old woman in pain, if I can prevent it." Tommy nodded, feeling a slight glimmer of hope. "I understand. I'm sorry I approached you like this. I just did not know where else to turn. I saw you here every day and I thought maybe you—" He trailed off, unsure what to say next. The man raised an eyebrow. "You thought what, that I look like a man who could help?" Tommy looked down. "Yes, sir. You look like someone who has options. I have none." For a moment Mir Anderson said nothing. Tommy could hear his own breathing. The waitress quietly returned to the other end of the diner, giving them space. The security guard watched but did not intervene. Other customers were trying not to stare openly, but the tension was obvious. Finally, Mir Anderson reached inside his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone and set it on the table. He tapped the screen a few times, then lifted his eyes to Tommy. "What's your address?" he asked. Tommy's heart fluttered. He leaned forward and gave the address, speaking slowly, so Mir Anderson could enter it into his phone. The man nodded and put the phone away. "I will check if this is a real address, and I can confirm what you're saying. I will help. But I need to know more. Who takes care of you now, with no parents?" Tommy gripped the edge of the table. "My grandmother tries, but she's too weak. I do most things. I get food. I make sure she has water. Sometimes I pick up leftover scraps here from the cook, so we do not starve. But I cannot buy medicine. I cannot pay rent. We're running out of time." Mir Anderson's face hardened. "This is bad," he said almost to himself. He looked around, lowered his voice again. "If I pay for your grandmother's medication, then what? How do I know you'll be safe after that? Medicine is not cheap and I cannot just hand out money every time you need something. Have you gone to social services? Have you tried anything else?" Tommy shook his head. "I do not know how. I'm just a kid. I'm doing what I can. I asked neighbors, but they have their own problems. Nobody has enough to share. I just know that right now she's in pain, and I need to help her." Mr. Anderson took a slow breath and leaned back in his seat. His eyes moved around the diner, taking in the plain walls, the scuffed floor, the customers pretending not to listen. He looked at the waitress, who gave him a small nod, as if encouraging him to do something. He tapped the table once more, then faced Tommy again. "All right," he said. "I'm going to make a call. I know people who can check on your grandmother's situation quickly. If what you're saying is true, I can arrange to have her seen by a doctor. I can cover the cost of the medication, but I need to confirm the facts." Tommy's chest tightened, but this time it was from relief, not fear. His voice came out shaky. "You do that?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Mir Anderson nodded, pulling his phone back out. Yes. But if I find out you lied to me... He left the sentence unfinished, letting the threat hang in the air. He tapped the phone screen, found a contact, and stepped out of the booth to make the call, in a low voice. Tommy could not hear much of what he said, only a few words like check, address and urgent. Tommy waited, feeling trapped between hope and terror. He had told the truth, so there was nothing to fear. Yet, he worried about how long his grandmother could last. He wiped at his eyes, trying to regain some composure. He noticed the waitress standing by the counter, arms crossed, watching with concern. The cook watched too, leaning on the counter, not saying anything. After a few moments, Mr. Anderson returned to the table. He tucked his phone away and fixed Tommy with a steady look. I have someone checking on your grandmother's condition. If it's as bad as you say, I can send help immediately. But I need you to understand something. This is not a simple favor. If I help you, I want to know more about your situation. I want to make sure you both are safe long term. I'm not just throwing money at a stranger and walking away. Tommy nodded quickly. Understand, sir. I'm grateful for anything you can do. I just need her to stop hurting. That's all I want right now. Mir Anderson looked at him for a long moment, without speaking. Eventually, he sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. We'll see what happens when I get the call back, he said. His voice sounded calmer now, less guarded. If the situation is real, I'll help. For now, just sit tight. Tommy felt the tension ease slightly. The security guard stayed by the door, but he seemed relaxed. The other customers pretended to focus on their meals, but the quiet in the diner told him they were all listening. The waitress finally moved to pour coffee for someone at the next table, her eyes darting back to Tommy and Mr. Anderson. From time to time, Tommy tried to breathe evenly. He wanted to say thank you, but he was afraid to speak too soon. Instead, he stayed quiet, feeling that Mir Anderson needed space to think. The man glanced at his newspaper, which lay folded beside him, but he did not pick it up again. He seemed focused on the phone in his pocket, waiting for some update. In that silence, Tommy felt a strange calm. He had done what he could. He had taken the risk. He had told the truth. Now he had to wait. But at least now he was not being ignored or dismissed. Someone with the power to help had finally listened. Mr. Anderson kept his phone close to him, occasionally tapping the screen to check if there was any incoming message. Tommy stayed quiet. He focused on controlling his breathing, aware that everyone in the diner still had at least half an ear on their conversation. The waitress poured coffee for a man at the far end of the counter, but her eyes drifted back toward Tommy and Mir Anderson from time to time. The cook scraped something off the grill, making a brief screeching sound, then went silent again. Mir Anderson looked at Tommy. You said your grandmother's been sick for a while, right? Tommy nodded yes. For at least a month or two. It got worse recently. She cannot get out of bed much. She's in pain all the time. Now his words came out softly. He kept his voice steady, just stating facts. He did not want to cry again. Mr. Anderson rubbed his chin. Does she have a doctor who knows about this? Tommy lowered his eyes. She did, but we could not afford follow-up visits. The last time we saw a doctor was weeks ago. He gave us a prescription, told us we needed more tests. But we never got them. It's too expensive. He paused, then looked back up. I tried to find free clinics, but they said we needed an appointment, and it takes forever. Mir Anderson's expression did not change much, but his eyes seemed more focused. Now he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. All right, he said quietly. If my contact confirms her condition, I'll arrange a doctor's visit. Maybe we can do something about those tests. Tommy felt a flicker of hope. He glanced at the security guard by the door, The guard met his eyes, then looked away, pretending to scan the street outside. The other customers were mostly quiet, some sipping coffee, some staring at their plates. It was as if the entire diner waited for the outcome of this strange situation. The sound of Me Anderson's phone vibrating broke the tension. He picked it up, pressed it to his ear, and spoke in a low voice. Tommy caught a few words. Yes. Check apartment condition. Tommy held his breath. He did not know who Mar Anderson had called, or how they were verifying anything, but he hoped they were fast. After a short conversation, Mar Anderson ended the call and placed the phone on the table. He looked at Tommy, his face still hard to read. They're sending someone over there right now. It will take a bit of time. Until then, we wait. Tommy nodded, relieved that something was happening. He wondered if this would really work. He kept quiet, not wanting to push the man any further. He had already risked a lot by asking for help so directly. Now that he had Mr. Anderson's partial cooperation, he needed to stay calm. Mr. Anderson tapped a finger on the table, looking past Tommy at the diner's interior. You come here often, he said, changing the subject. You said you've seen me here before. Tommy swallowed and answered truthfully. I come in the morning, sometimes to see if I can get leftovers. The cook gives me some bread or bacon sometimes. I never asked for money. I just took what I could get and left. Mr. Anderson nodded. I see. He looked toward the kitchen. The cook pretended to be busy, but it was obvious she was listening. Mr. Anderson turned back to Tommy. So you've been surviving on scraps from here? Tommy shifted in his seat. Mostly. Sometimes I pick up cans outside and trade them in for a few dollars. Sometimes neighbors give me a little food, but it's never enough to buy medicine. He paused, remembering the prescription and how he had looked at it over and over, hoping to find a solution. I did what I could. Mr. Anderson sighed quietly. This is not a good situation. Kid. He rubbed his eyes. If I help you once, you'll need help again. Your grandmother needs ongoing care, not just a one-time fix. Tommy heard the words and felt a lump in his throat, but he tried to stay calm. I know, he said. But if you help now, at least she will not be in pain. I can figure out the rest later. Maybe I'll find some way. Mr. Anderson cut him off, shaking his head. We'll see what can be done. One step at a time. The waitress approached cautiously. She spoke softly, as if not to break a fragile balance. Can I get you anything else? Mr. Anderson, another coffee. She looked at Tommy, gave a brief sympathetic nod, but kept her attention on the man. Mr. Anderson glanced at his coffee cup. It was half empty. Sure, he said. Pushing the cup forward, he looked at Tommy. Do you want something, food or a drink? Tommy hesitated. He was hungry, but he felt awkward asking for anything else. Still, the question sounded genuine. Maybe just some toast, he said, barely above a whisper. The waitress nodded and left to get their orders. Mr. Anderson leaned back in the booth again, his eyes drifting to the window outside. The morning sun rose higher, brightening the sidewalk. People walked by, looking in through the glass. None of them knew what was happening inside. Tommy tried to calm the nervous energy inside him. He thought about his grandmother lying in bed. He hoped that whoever Mr. Anderson sent would help. He hoped she would not be scared. He had left her that morning without explaining much. He just said he would try to do something. She had looked at him with tired eyes and said nothing. After a few minutes, the waitress returned with fresh coffee for Mr. Anderson and a plate of toast for Tommy. Tommy muttered a quiet thank you. He picked up a piece of toast, ate it slowly, savoring the taste of something other than stale bread. From home, it was dry and plain, but at least it filled his stomach a bit. Mr. Anderson took a sip of his coffee and watched Tommy eat. You said your parents died 2 months ago, he said, his voice controlled. Car accident, right? Tommy nodded, his mouth full of toast. He swallowed before speaking. Yes, sir. It happened late at night. I was at home sleeping, my grandmother told me. The next morning they never came back. Mr. Anderson's jaw tightened. He looked away briefly, then turned back. That's rough, he said. I'm sorry. Tommy said nothing. He just nodded and kept eating his toast, not wanting to talk too much about that. It was a raw subject, and he was barely holding himself together. They fell into a tense silence. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, then faded away. The security guard shuffled his feet near the door. The customers kept their voices low, as if afraid to interrupt something important. The cook pretended to rearrange glasses on a shelf, her back turned to them after some time. Mr. Anderson's phone vibrated again. He picked it up, read something on the screen, and then typed a quick reply. He slipped it back into his jacket pocket. Tommy watched his face, trying to guess what the message said, but the man gave no hint. Someone will check on your grandmother's apartment soon, Mr. Anderson said. If she's really in that state, they'll contact me, and I'll make arrangements for proper care. She needs a doctor's visit, pain medication, maybe more. It will not be cheap, but that's not your concern right now. Tommy let out a slow breath. Thank you, he said. I mean it, thank you. Branson nodded once, accepting the thanks without comment. He looked at Tommy's plate. You can have more toast if you want, he said, or something else. You look hungry. Tommy shook his head. This is fine, he said, picking at the crust. He felt uneasy accepting too much. He did not want Mr. Anderson to think he was taking advantage of his kindness. Mr. Anderson sighed. Suit yourself, he said. He took another drink of coffee, placed the cup down and folded his arms. This might take a while. Are you going to stay here until we have news? Tommy considered this. He did not want to leave without knowing what would happen. He felt safer here now that Mr. Anderson was involved. At home his grandmother was alone, but he could not help her there. Here at least he could receive updates. I'll wait, Tommy said. I want to know what happens. Mr. Anderson nodded. All right, just stay quiet and do not cause trouble. I'm not in the mood for drama. I'm doing this because it feels like the right thing to do, not because I enjoy it. Tommy managed a small, grateful smile. I understand. They sat there, the two of them, a well-dressed businessman and a skinny kid, who had approached him out of nowhere. The other people in the diner still listened quietly, their meals half finished. The waitress moved around refilling coffee cups, but said nothing more to them. Mr. Anderson kept his phone on the table face down. He drummed his fingers softly, waiting. Tommy finished his toast and set the plate aside. He leaned back, trying to relax, though his body still felt tense. He listened to the hum of the lights, the soft clatter of utensils, and the quiet footsteps of the waitress. For now there was nothing left to do but wait for that call or message. The tension remained, but at least Tommy was not alone in it anymore. He had made it this far. He hoped it would be enough. Mr. Anderson kept one eye on his phone, waiting for news. Tommy sat across from him, barely moving. The diner's quiet murmurs continued in the background. The waitress refilled a cup for a man at the far end. The cook stacked clean plates near the grill, and the security guard stood near the door, arms folded. No one spoke to Tommy or Mr. Anderson. They all pretended to go about their business, but it was clear the room's mood depended on that phone on the table. After a few long minutes, Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed. He picked it up quickly and answered. Tommy leaned forward, trying to catch any clue from the man's face. Mr. Anderson said a few words like yes and understood, then ended the call. He placed the phone down, took a slow breath and faced Tommy. They confirm someone is at your apartment. Mr. Anderson said they found your grandmother. She's in bad shape. The person I sent says she's in pain and needs immediate medical attention. Tommy felt a rush of relief and fear at the same time. So you believe me now? He asked. His voice was low. Anderson nodded. I believe you, there's no doubt. He picked up his phone again and started making another call. I'm going to arrange for a private ambulance. It's faster and simpler than dealing with the usual system. Your grandmother needs help now. Tommy lowered his head for a moment, feeling tears well up again. He wiped them quickly and focused on what was happening. This was what he needed. Help was on the way. While Mr. Anderson spoke on the phone, Tommy listened to his words. I need a medical team at this address. Yes, right now. I'll cover all costs. No, I do not care about the price. Just get it done. Mr. Anderson ended the call and looked at Tommy. They'll be there soon. Tommy tried to speak, but no words came out at first. He finally managed to quiet. Thank you. He stared down at his hands, unsure what else to say. The weight in his chest felt lighter now. He knew his grandmother would get medicine, a doctor, something. Anything would be better than letting her suffer alone. Mr. Anderson's face remained serious. You understand that this is a big step, right? He said. I'm not just paying for pills. I'm getting a full medical team out there. They'll see what needs to be done. Tommy nodded. I know. I'm grateful. I cannot say how much this means. The waitress approached cautiously, holding a fresh pot of coffee. Everything all right here? She asked, her voice quiet. She glanced at Tommy, then at Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson nodded without looking up. We're fine, he said. Just waiting for some updates. He did not elaborate, and the waitress took the hint. Backing away, she resumed her routine, refilling cups and wiping the counter. The other customers continued eating in silence, still curious but less tense, now that the situation seemed under control. Tommy took a deep breath. What happens next? He asked. Will they take my grandmother to a hospital? Mr. Anderson leaned back slightly. Yes, a private clinic. Most likely they'll make sure she's stable. Give her medication for the pain and do some tests. I'll get a report from them. And if everything checks out, I'll handle the bills for now. Tommy blinked, surprised by the offer. You're going to pay for all that? The man shrugged. I'm not going to start something and then just stop halfway. If I help properly. It's the right thing to do. He looked irritated, as if annoyed at his own decision. But we need to talk about you too. Who's been looking after you since your parents died? Tommy swallowed. No one really, just me and my grandmother. We were okay for a while, but then she got sick. He felt uncomfortable discussing his personal life in front of strangers, but he had no choice. I tried to keep up with everything, but I'm a kid. I cannot earn real money. Mr. Anderson tapped the table with a fingertip. We'll figure something out first. Let's focus on getting her care. Once she's stable, we can discuss the rest. Tommy nodded. He noticed the security guard watching them from near the door. The man's posture had relaxed. He no longer looked ready to throw Tommy out. Instead, he just seemed curious. The cook glanced over her shoulder again, eyebrows raised as if trying to read the situation. Time passed slowly. Mr. Anderson checked his phone every couple of minutes. Tommy shifted in his seat. Anxious for news, he imagined the private ambulance arriving at his apartment, paramedics climbing the stairs, finding his grandmother in bed. He wondered if she was scared. He wished he could be there with her, but this was the only way. After what felt like a long wait, Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed again. He answered immediately. Yes. Good. Understood. He ended the call and set the phone down. They're with her now, he said. They're giving her something for the pain and getting her ready to move. She'll be taken to a private clinic. I have doctors I trust she'll get proper attention. Tommy closed his eyes briefly. Relief washed over him. Thank you, he said again. Voice uneven. I did not know what else to do. Anderson waved a hand. I said I'd help. And I am, that's all. He looked around the diner. This place, you've been coming here for a while. Surviving on scraps, that's not going to work anymore. We need to talk about how to fix your situation. Tommy nodded slowly. I know. But right now, I'm just glad my grandmother is getting help. He paused, then spoke quietly. I'm sorry if I bothered you this morning. I did not mean to cause a scene. Anderson snorted. A scene? Maybe a little. But I guess I understand you. You did what you had to. He reached for his coffee cup, took a sip and set it back down. He looked at Tommy's plate. You sure you do not want more food? Tommy shook his head. I'm okay for now. I can eat later once I know she's safe. He felt strange discussing food when his grandmother's fate was still uncertain. But at least something was being done. Anderson checked his phone again. They'll call me once she's settled in the clinic. After that I'll arrange a visit. You should be there. He paused, thinking. Do you have a key to your apartment? Tommy patted his pocket. Yes. I have it. Anderson nodded. Good. After she's taken care of, I might need to see where you live. Understand what we're dealing with. Tommy's voice tightened. It's not nice. The place is old and run down. The landlord does not fix anything. The neighbors keep to themselves. We barely have enough money for rent. Mr. Anderson nodded, not looking surprised. As I said, one step at a time. First we get her stable, then we see what's next. The waitress refilled Anderson's coffee, without a word. He thanked her curtly. She smiled at Tommy. Just a quick, tight smile. Then moved on. The security guard rubbed the back of his neck, looking unsure if he should stay by the door or leave. The customers had returned to their quiet meals. The diner's atmosphere felt calmer now. Everyone seemed relieved that the confrontation had turned into something productive. No one asked questions. No one challenged Mr. Anderson's decisions. They recognized that he was in control now. Tommy shifted in his seat. How long do you think until we know something? He asked. I just want to know if she's going to be okay. Anderson shrugged. Hard to say. Maybe an hour or two. They have to run tests. See what she needs. Pain management. Maybe some surgery if required. I do not know. I'm not a doctor. He looked at Tommy, his expression neutral. You're not going anywhere, right? You'll wait here until we get the next update. Tommy nodded. I'll wait. He had nowhere else to go and no reason to leave. If he went home, the apartment would be empty. His grandmother would be on her way to the clinic. By now he felt safer staying near Anderson. Until he knew for sure what was happening. Mr. Anderson drank his coffee, staring at the tabletop. Tommy glanced around the diner again. The tension had eased, but now there was a heavy sense of anticipation. They all waited for the next piece of news, the next call or message, that would say what the doctors found. At least now Tommy was not alone in this. He had asked for help, and against all odds, help had come. He could breathe a little easier, knowing his grandmother was no longer alone and in pain. Anderson and Tommy remained at the booth. The diner's hum continued softly in the background. The waitress brought more coffee for Anderson. Without speaking, he nodded at her, then returned his attention to the phone on the table. Tommy kept his eyes on that phone as well, waiting for any sign of incoming calls or messages. After several minutes of quiet tension, Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed. He picked it up immediately and spoke in a controlled tone. Yes, he listened, tapped his fingers on the table and then nodded. All right, send me the details. Keep her comfortable. He ended the call and set the phone down. Tommy leaned forward, feeling the nerves in his chest. Is she okay? Mr. Anderson took a moment before answering. They have her at the clinic now. She's stable and receiving pain medication. They'll run tests to see what's needed next. The doctor will call back with more information soon. Tommy exhaled. He gripped the edge of the table. That's good, at least she's not in pain anymore. Mr. Anderson nodded. It's a start. He looked at Tommy. This is not going to be simple. Your grandmother will need ongoing care and a better living situation. You understand that, right? Tommy swallowed. I know. I do not know how to fix all that. I just knew I had to do something. I'm sorry if that put pressure on you. Mr. Anderson shook his head. I made a choice to help you. Do not need to apologize. But now that I'm involved, I want to understand more. How have you been surviving since your parents died? Did no one from social services contact you? Tommy looked down at his hands. I got a letter once. It asked for documents and said, we might qualify for something. But I did not know how to handle it. My grandmother was too weak to deal with it. I tried to fill out some forms, but I got confused. I never followed through. Mr. Anderson frowned. So you've been alone with no guidance? No support. Tommy nodded. Yes, sir. He rubbed his arm, feeling ashamed. I just did what I could. I sold a few things from the apartment, cheap stuff to buy groceries. I took handouts, leftovers. I tried to make it work. Mr. Anderson sighed quietly. This is not acceptable. You're a child. You should not be doing all this alone. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. Once your grandmother's condition is clearer, we'll figure out a plan. You need a stable environment. You need school, regular meals, and a place where you're not begging for scraps. Tommy nodded, unsure what to say. The idea of a real solution felt too big to grasp. He had only hoped for medicine, not a complete change in his life. After a few more minutes of silence, the waitress approached again, her posture cautious. Do you need anything else? She asked quietly, looking Mr. Anderson first, then at Tommy. Mr. Anderson glanced at Tommy. You hungry? You have not eaten much. Tommy shrugged. I'm fine. But maybe a glass of water would help. The waitress gave a quick nod and left to get the water. Mr. Anderson tapped at his phone, checking for messages. The cook worked quietly behind the counter. The security guard remained at the door, and the customers kept their voices low. When the waitress returned with a glass of water, Tommy took it and sipped carefully. It tasted clean and cool. He realized he was thirsty. He thanked the waitress, who gave a small nod and walked away. The calm atmosphere in the diner felt strange, compared to the tension of before. Mr. Anderson looked at Tommy. You said you do not have any other family members who can help. Tommy shook his head. No. My grandmother is the only one left on my mother's side. My father did not have siblings. There's no one else that I know about. Mr. Anderson pressed his lips together. Then it's just you two. That means someone has to step in and provide stability. If your grandmother is too sick to work or care for you, there needs to be another arrangement. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of arrangement? Mr. Anderson looked uncomfortable for a moment, but he kept his tone level. Potentially a foster situation. Or maybe I can help arrange legal support. You cannot just stay in that apartment alone, with no income and a sick grandmother. You need more than a one-time fix. Tommy's stomach tightened. He did not like the idea of strangers coming in and taking him away. He needed his grandmother, and he wanted to be there for her. I will not leave her, he said firmly. Mr. Anderson raised a hand. I'm not saying you have to leave her. I'm saying we need a proper solution. Maybe home care, maybe some long-term plan. But that costs money and requires legal steps. Tommy's voice grew tense. I understand, I just do not want to be separated. She's all I have left. Mr. Anderson nodded. I get it. Let's see what the doctor say first. If she can recover with treatment, maybe we can find a stable living arrangement. If she's too sick to work, then at least you can have consistent support, so you're not out here begging. Tommy lowered his head. He felt like a burden. And the thought of depending on Mr. Anderson's kindness for everything made him uneasy, but he knew he had no other option. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know it's complicated. I just needed help." Mr. Anderson checked his phone again. "We should hear from the doctor soon," he said. "They'll want to know what to do next, and I'll approve the treatments." He paused, considering something. "Do you know what condition your grandmother has? The person you mentioned a month or two ago. Did they say what kind of treatment she needed?" Tommy shook his head. "They mentioned tests. Something about needing to see a specialist. I only know it's painful. She cannot walk properly. She cannot sleep well. It's been getting worse." "Not better." Mr. Anderson nodded grimly. "All right. The doctors at the clinic will figure it out." He leaned back in the booth. "You'll need to trust them. They know what they're doing." Tommy nodded, trying to stay calm. "I trust them," he said. "I just want her to feel better." Silence settled over them again. The diner went on with its quiet routine. The waitress refilled coffee for other customers. The cook started preparing something new on the grill, and the security guard shifted his weight from one foot to another outside. The daylight grew brighter, cars and pedestrians passing by. Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed once more. He answered quickly. "Yes." He listened, his jaw tightening. "Understood. Do what needs to be done." He ended the call and set the phone down, looking at Tommy. "They're starting some tests now. They want to make sure they identify what's causing the pain. It might take a few hours." Tommy nodded. At least she's getting help. He looked around the diner, then back at Mr. Anderson. "Do I need to stay here or can we go to the clinic?" Mr. Anderson shook his head. "They said to wait. Doctors do not like having people hover in the halls. Let them work when they have news. I'll know and then we can decide what to do next." Tommy glanced at the door. He felt uneasy just sitting around, but he had nowhere else to be. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." Mr. Anderson considered Tommy for a moment. "You've been strong through all this. I'm not saying that to compliment you, just to acknowledge it. Most kids would not handle it so well." Tommy shrugged, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm just doing what I have to. I do not have a choice." Mr. Anderson said nothing to that. He drummed his fingers on the table, then stopped as if catching himself. He seemed lost in thought. Tommy wondered what kind of person Mr. Anderson was outside this diner. Was he always serious and detached? Or did he have a family of his own? He decided not to ask. It would not help right now. He just needed to be patient. Time passed slowly. The tension in Tommy's shoulders eased slightly, knowing his grandmother was in expert hands. He looked around, noticing details he had not before. The slight cracks in the diner's flooring, the faded photographs on the wall, the way the waitress moved quietly from one customer to another. Everything seemed simple compared to the problems he faced, but at least now he had help. Mr. Anderson cleared his throat. "If this takes hours, we might need to eat something. You sure you're not hungry?" His tone was neutral but less harsh than before. Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "Actually, maybe just something small. I do not want to get sick from not eating. Just some eggs or toast, nothing big." Mr. Anderson signaled the waitress. She came over with a cautious smile. "What can I get you?" "Some scrambled eggs and toast for the kid," Mr. Anderson said, "and another coffee for me." The waitress wrote it down and walked off. Mr. Anderson tapped his phone again, checking the time. "We'll wait here, eat, and see what the doctor say. That's all we can do now." Tommy accepted this feeling, that at least he was not alone anymore. He had someone on his side. someone with the power to help. It might not solve everything immediately, but it was a start. The waitress brought the scrambled eggs and toast, setting the plate in front of Tommy. He thanked her in a low voice. The food smelled simple but good. He picked up the fork and started eating slowly, aware that Mir Anderson was watching him. The man said nothing at first, just sipped his coffee, looking at his phone from time to time. The customers in the diner went about their meals, some paying their bills and leaving. The security guard remained near the door, though his posture was relaxed. Now, the cook placed some clean dishes on a shelf and wiped the counter. Tommy focused on the warm eggs, chewing carefully, trying to ease the hollow feeling in his stomach. After a while, Mr. Anderson cleared his throat. It might be a while before we hear anything else. The doctors have tests to run, and probably need time to interpret the results. Tommy nodded, swallowing a bite of toast. I know, he said. I'll wait as long as it takes. I just want her to be okay. Mr. Anderson shifted in his seat. I know this is hard, but she's in good hands. They'll find out what's wrong and treat it. In the meantime, we need to consider your situation. You cannot go back to living the way you were. Tommy looked at the table. I know, he repeated quietly. But I do not know what else to do. I do not have money, I do not have anyone. Mr. Anderson tapped the table lightly with a finger. That's why I'm here, I'm getting involved now. I have contacts who can arrange proper housing and medical support. But first I need to understand what's possible. If your grandmother recovers enough to go home, we might need a home nurse. Or we might need to relocate you both, somewhere safer and cleaner. Tommy nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Do we have to leave the apartment? Mir Anderson shrugged. If it's not suitable, yes. You mentioned it's run down and you cannot pay rent. Even if your grandmother recovers, how will you afford it? You need a stable environment. Tommy's eyes stung, but he did not cry this time. He just accepted the reality of the situation. I understand, he said. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. Mir Anderson lowered his voice. You have to trust me on this. I'm stepping in because I cannot ignore what I've seen. But if you want my help, you have to cooperate. No hiding facts or trying to solve everything alone. Tommy met his eyes. I will. I'm telling you everything I know. I do not have anything to hide. Mir Anderson took another sip of coffee, then nodded. Good. He glanced at his phone, checking the time. The doctors said it could take a few hours. We've been here a while already. If you need to use the restroom or stretch your legs, feel free. I'm not going anywhere. Tommy considered it. He realized he had not left his seat since he confronted Mr. Anderson. His legs felt stiff. Maybe I'll use the restroom, he said quietly. Go ahead, Mr. Anderson replied, pointing to the back of the diner. I'll be here. Tommy slid out of the booth and walked toward the restrooms. On his way, he passed the waitress, who gave him a small nod. The hall to the restroom smelled of cleaning supplies. Inside, Tommy splashed water on his face. Looking at himself in the mirror, he saw a tired kid, dark rings under his eyes. But at least now there was hope. He dried his face with a paper towel and headed back out. When he returned, Mir Anderson was speaking quietly to the waitress. She nodded and then walked away. He looked up at Tommy. I asked her to bring you some juice. You need more than just toast and eggs. Tommy managed a small smile. Thank you, he said, feeling shy about all this help. He slid back into the booth, adjusting himself on the vinyl seat. They waited in silence for a few minutes. The waitress brought a small glass of orange juice. For Tommy, he took a sip. It was fresh and slightly tart, waking him up a bit. After what felt like another long stretch of quiet, Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed again. He answered, listening carefully, his face tense. Tommy waited, not daring to interrupt. After a brief exchange, Anderson ended the call. They've done some initial tests, Mr. Anderson said, looking at Tommy. Your grandmother's condition is serious but treatable. She'll need medication, physical therapy, and possibly surgery. The doctors need more time to determine the best course of action. Tommy pressed his palms together, relieved and worried at the same time. But she's stable. Anderson nodded yes. They're controlling her pain. She's awake and aware. They said she asked about you. She was worried you'd be scared. Tommy felt tears rise again, but he kept them in check. I'm glad she's not in pain, he said quietly. Can I see her soon? Anderson considered this. They suggested waiting until they finalize a treatment plan. Visiting now might not be ideal. Let's give them a little more time. Maybe after they have a solid plan, we can go there. Tommy took a slow breath. Okay. If that's what they say, he knew the doctors were busy. At least his grandmother was safe. Mr. Anderson drummed his fingers on the table. We should think ahead. If she needs surgery or long-term care, I can cover it, but I need to make arrangements. I have contacts at a law firm who can help set up proper guardianship or something similar. You cannot remain in legal limbo. Tommy's chest tightened. What does that mean? Will someone else become my guardian? Mr. Anderson stared at him. Potentially, if your grandmother cannot handle it. Someone else might need to step in. That might mean me. Or it might mean a legal caretaker the court assigns. It depends on what's best for you both. Tommy's mind spun. He never imagined something like this. But what choice did he have? Without help, he and his grandmother could not survive. I just do not want to lose her, he said quietly. Anderson nodded, his tone calmer now. I understand. We'll try to keep you together, but we need a stable environment. You should be going to school, not searching for scraps at a diner. Tommy nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. This was also sudden. He had expected just enough help to buy medicine, and now he was facing a complete overhaul of his life. They fell silent again. Tommy sipped his juice, thinking about his grandmother. She would be confused, maybe scared. He hoped the doctors and nurses were kind to her. He hoped she understood that this was all to help her. Outside, the daylight grew brighter. The world went on as usual. Inside the diner, it felt like time had slowed down to accommodate their wait. The waitress offered a refill of coffee to Mr. Anderson, who declined. The cook wiped down the counter, taking brief glances in their direction. After a few more minutes, Anderson spoke again. I'm going to call my lawyer. I'll explain the situation and ask for advice. In the meantime, you just wait here. Finish your juice, relax as best you can. I know it's not comfortable, but we have to handle things step by step. Tommy nodded. I understand. He watched Mr. Anderson step away, making a phone call in a low voice near the diner's entrance. The security guard gave the man a respectful nod. The two men spoke quietly out of Tommy's hearing range. Tommy looked at the empty plate and the half-finished juice. He felt better with something in his stomach. He never expected this turn of events, but now he had to trust Mr. Anderson. If the man was willing to help with doctors, clinics and lawyers, Tommy had to believe it could lead to a better life. Mr. Anderson returned to the booth after a few minutes on the phone. He looked tired but determined. My lawyer will send someone to the clinic to check on legal procedures. For now, we wait for the doctors to come back with a treatment plan. Once they know what's needed, I'll approve the expenses. Tommy's shoulders relaxed a bit. Thank you. I know you do not have to do this, but you're doing it anyway. I will not forget that. Anderson nodded. Just focus on your grandmother's recovery. That's the first step. After that, we'll deal with living arrangements, education, and whatever else is needed. Tommy accepted that. He had never had anyone guide him through a crisis before. It felt strange to rely on a stranger. But Mr. Anderson was no longer just a stranger. He was the only person who stepped up to help. They settled back into a quiet waiting mode. The tension slightly eased by the knowledge that his grandmother was stable and receiving care. Tommy held on to that thought, hoping everything would work out in the end. Mir Anderson kept his phone on the table face up, so he could see any incoming calls or messages. Immediately, Tommy sat quietly, thinking about what the doctors might say. He had to trust them. The idea of his grandmother undergoing surgery or long treatment scared him, but at least now it was possible. Without Mir Anderson's help, there would be nothing but pain and uncertainty. The waitress returned this time, not offering anything, but just looking at them both with a cautious expression. Mir Anderson glanced up. "We're fine," he said. Voice calm. She nodded and moved away. Tommy noticed the place was less crowded now. Some customers had finished their meals and left. The security guards still watched the door, occasionally looking their way. The cook went about her tasks without comment. Mr. Anderson checked the time on his phone. They said a few hours, but these things can take longer. Medical test consultations. Planning procedures, we have to be patient. Tommy nodded. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He looked around the diner. "Thank you for not pushing me to leave. I know this must be weird for you." Mir Anderson shrugged. "It's not how I planned my morning, that's for sure, but there's no point rushing around. The doctors will call when they know something. Until then we wait." He paused, studying Tommy's face. "What about school? Have you been going at all?" Tommy lowered his eyes. "I tried to go after my parents died, but I missed days. My grandmother got sicker, and I stopped altogether a few weeks ago. There was no time and I felt guilty leaving her alone. I know it's bad, but I did not know what else to do." Mir Anderson shook his head. "We'll fix that. You need to get back to school. Cannot build a future without it." He did not sound angry, just stating a fact. Tommy nodded, feeling a tug of shame. "I know I'm behind, but if my grandmother gets better, and if we have a safe place, I can go back." Mir Anderson agreed. "We'll arrange it. I can talk to some people, see if we can get you enrolled somewhere decent, maybe even tutoring if you're behind. But first the medical situation has to be settled." Tommy heard the word "we" and it felt strange. Just yesterday he was alone with no prospects, and now a wealthy businessman was saying "we," like they were a team. It was comforting and scary at the same time. He did not want to become dependent or disappoint Mir Anderson. Still, this was better than starvation and fear. Time passed slowly. The overhead lights hummed softly. The waitress refilled Mr. Anderson's coffee without a word, and he murmured a brief thanks. Outside, footsteps and traffic moved along the street. Normal life continuing inside. Tommy's world hung on the next phone call. Eventually, Mir Anderson's phone vibrated again. He grabbed it, quickly answering in a measured voice. Tommy leaned forward, trying to guess from his expression what was happening. Mir Anderson listened, asking a few short questions. "When? What's the next step? How long?" Tommy waited, hands clenched under the table. Mir Anderson ended the call and took a breath before facing Tommy. "They have a treatment plan now. Your grandmother needs surgery, but it's not an emergency operation. More of a scheduled procedure to address the underlying issue. She'll remain in the clinic for a while, receiving proper medication and preparing for surgery." Tommy's heart pounded. "So she'll be okay?" Mr. Anderson raised a hand. "The doctors believe so. It will take time. Weeks, maybe longer. She'll need follow-up care and therapy. But they think she can recover enough to live without constant pain." Tommy felt tears at the corners of his eyes again. But this time they were tears of relief. He wiped them quickly. "That's good. That's really good." He paused, voice cracking slightly. "Thank you." Mr. Anderson nodded, looking down at the table. I said I'd help, and I meant it. The doctors will handle the medical side. I'll cover the costs. But now we must figure out your living situation. Tommy swallowed. If she's staying at the clinic, what do? I do not want to be apartment alone. Mr. Anderson considered this. You should not be alone. You cannot handle all this on your own. I'll need to arrange something safe for you. Maybe a temporary place, or we could see if the clinic can let you stay nearby. But clinics do not usually let kids hang around without supervision. Tommy's mind raced. I do not know anyone else who can take me in. We have no family. I do not want to go into some institution. Mr. Anderson tilted his head slightly. I'm aware that's not ideal. Let's see what my lawyer can do. Maybe I can establish temporary guardianship, so that you're under my care until your grandmother recovers. That would give us time to find a long-term solution. Tommy blinked, surprised you would do that. Mr. Anderson looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. I do not see a better option right now. You need stability. If I leave you alone, you'll just end up back here begging for scraps. That's not acceptable. Tommy's voice was faint. I appreciate it. I do not know how to thank you for all this. Mr. Anderson's tone was flat. Do not thank me yet. We have a lot to do. Paperwork, legal steps, arranging a safe place for you to stay. And you'll have to follow rules. No disappearing. No skipping school once we get you back in. Understood. Tommy nodded quickly. I understand. Mr. Anderson checked his phone again, then looked at Tommy. Do you want to see her now? The doctor said we can visit, but it might not be today. They still need to do some final prep and get her settled. Maybe tomorrow would be better, but if you insist, I can arrange it. Tommy thought about it. He wanted to see her, but not if it meant complicating things for the doctors. If tomorrow is better for her, I can wait. I just want her to be comfortable. Mr. Anderson accepted that answer. Then we'll wait. I'll call the clinic again later to confirm. Once she's settled in and resting, I'll take you there. You can talk to her. Let her know you're safe. Tommy nodded. Thank you, he said again, realizing it was the only thing he could say. This man was changing everything. They lapsed into silence again. Tommy finished his juice. The waitress came by, took the empty plate and glass and left. The cook stepped out from behind the counter to wipe down an empty booth, her eyes flicking their way once or twice. Mr. Anderson tapped a message into his phone and set it down. I've asked my lawyer to start the guardianship process. It will not be easy, but it's doable if your grandmother agrees. Once she's awake and stable, we'll talk to her. If she wants me to take care of you temporarily, we'll make it official. Tommy felt relief and worry blend again. He was glad not to be sent off somewhere unknown, but he barely knew Mr. Anderson. You're sure about this? He asked softly. You do not even know me. Mr. Anderson looked Tommy in the eye. I know enough. You were desperate, but honest. You did not try to trick me. You risked everything to help your grandmother. That tells me you're worth helping. Besides, I can afford it. I'm not doing this out of charity. I'm doing it because someone has to, and I happen to be here when you ask. Tommy nodded slowly. I guess that's fair. They sat quietly as the diner settled into a mid-morning lull. The security guard stepped outside for a moment, stretching his legs. The cook disappeared into the kitchen. The waitress refilled some coffee cups at the counter. Tommy and Mr. Anderson waited, each lost in their own thoughts. After a few minutes, Mr. Anderson cleared his throat. We should get you cleaned up, and maybe find some clothes for you. If you're staying with me temporarily, I cannot have you wearing the same worn-out clothes. And I need to know what to do about your apartment. Are there things you need to bring? Tommy considered this. I guess I have a few personal items, maybe a family photo and my grandmother's things. But most of it is old and worn out. I do not have much. Mr. Anderson nodded. We can handle that later first. Let's confirm tomorrow's visit with your grandmother. After that we'll figure out the rest. One step at a time. Tommy agreed, feeling tired. He had been through so much already. Now that help was here. He just had to trust Mr. Anderson and follow along. It was a strange feeling, putting his fate in someone else's hands. But at least those hands were capable. The diner remained quiet, the tension eased. For the first time in weeks, Tommy did not feel completely alone or hopeless. He clung to that feeling, hoping it would last. Mr. Anderson tapped his phone screen and looked at Tommy. The doctor says, we can visit your grandmother tomorrow morning. By then, she should be settled and ready for a short visit. She'll be on medication, so do not be alarmed if she's tired. Tommy nodded, relieved. I understand, as long as I can see her and make sure she's okay. Mr. Anderson leaned back in the booth. We've been here a while. I've handled the medical part and contacted my lawyer. It might be time we leave the diner and handle some practical things. You'll need a place to sleep tonight. I can arrange a room in a decent hotel for now. Later we can work on something more permanent. Tommy tensed slightly. A hotel with you. Mr. Anderson waved a hand dismissively. Do not worry, I'm not putting you in a strange situation. I'll get 2 separate rooms. You're not staying in a rundown apartment alone. And I'm not dropping you off with strangers. Until we have a legal arrangement. This is the simplest option. Tommy hesitated, then nodded. I trust you, he said quietly. He still felt unsure, but there were no better options. Staying here was not an option. Going back home alone made no sense. And Mr. Anderson was offering help and safety. That was more than he had hoped for this morning. Mr. Anderson finished his coffee and placed the cup down. Before we go, we should settle the bill. He waved the waitress over. She approached holding a small notepad. Just the coffee, eggs, toast and juice, Mr. Anderson said. I'll pay now. The waitress quickly totaled it up. That'll be $12.50. Mr. Anderson pulled out a wallet, took out a bill and handed it to her. Keep the change, he said flatly. He did not say anything else, and the waitress just nodded, thanking him softly as she walked away. Tommy looked at Mr. Anderson. Thank you for the food, he said. I had not eaten a proper meal in a while. Mr. Anderson stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. Do not mention it, let's go. We have a lot to do. Tommy slid out of the booth. He felt stiff from sitting so long. He followed Mr. Anderson across the diner. The security guard stepped aside, holding the door open for them without a word. Outside the day was bright, the sidewalk busy. People passed, unaware of what had just happened inside. Mr. Anderson paused on the sidewalk, scanning the street. I have a car service that can pick us up, he said. He took out his phone, tapped the screen and then put it away. They'll be here in a few minutes. Tommy stood beside him, feeling awkward. He noticed Mr. Anderson's expensive suit and compared it with his own worn jeans and t-shirt. He realized he must look out of place. But Mr. Anderson did not comment on that. He just waited calmly, ignoring the curious looks from a few passers-by. Within minutes, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Mr. Anderson gestured for Tommy to get in. Tommy hesitated but then climbed in, settling on the seat. Mr. Anderson followed and closed the door. The interior smelled like leather and fresh air. The driver got back behind the wheel and waited for instructions. Take us to the Midtown Hotel, Mr. Anderson said. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic. Tommy looked out the window as the city moved by. He felt strange sitting in such a nice car, heading to a hotel, with a man he had only approached a few hours ago. But he had no reason to distrust him now. Mr. Anderson had done everything he promised, and more. Mr. Anderson cleared his throat. When we get to the hotel, I'll check us in. I'll pay for both rooms. I'll have my lawyer fax some documents there, and we'll start the guardianship process. It will not be official overnight, but at least I can show the hotel staff that you're under my protection. Tommy nodded, trying to understand. Okay. What do I need to do for now? Just stay put, do not wander off. I know you're not the type to cause trouble, but I need you to be patient. The doctors will call me if anything changes with your grandmother. Tomorrow we'll go see her together. Tommy's chest felt tight. Thank you, he said again. He kept repeating it, but he had no other words to express his gratitude. He turned his gaze back to the window, watching people carry grocery bags, hail taxis, and walk in and out of shops. His life had changed so much in a few hours. This morning he was desperate and hopeless. Now he had help, a plan and hope for his grandmother's recovery. They reached the Midtown Hotel. The driver parked under a covered entrance. A doorman in a neat uniform opened the car door, greeting me Anderson politely. Tommy climbed out, feeling the cool shade of the awning. Mr. Anderson thanked the driver and the doorman, then guided Tommy through the glass doors into the hotel lobby. The lobby was quiet and smelled like flowers. Soft music played in the background. A woman at the reception desk smiled at Mr. Anderson. Welcome, sir. How can we help you today? I need 2 rooms connected if possible, Mr. Anderson said. He took out a credit card. We'll be staying at least a few days. Maybe longer, the receptionist typed on her computer. We have adjoining rooms available on the 5th floor. Will that suit you? Mr. Anderson nodded. That's fine. I'll need to add a minor under my care as well. He glanced at Tommy, who stood quietly by his side. We'll have some paperwork arriving by fax soon. The receptionist handed him 2 key cards. Certainly, sir. Just let us know if you need anything else. The fax number is on the card in your room. Our staff can deliver documents directly to you. Thank you, Mr. Anderson said. He took the key cards, handed one to Tommy. We'll go up together, do not worry. I'm not leaving you alone just yet. Tommy followed him to the elevator. He held the key card nervously. Everything here looked clean and expensive, from the marble floor to the polished elevator doors. He wondered if this was all real, or just a dream he'd wake from. They rode up to the 5th floor, stepping into a quiet hallway with soft lighting. Mr. Anderson led the way to their rooms. He opened the first door and showed Tommy a small, but comfortable room with a bed and a TV. There was a door connecting it to the next room. This is your room, Mr. Anderson said. I'll be in the one next door. If you need anything, just knock. There's room service if you get hungry. But do not go anywhere without telling me first. Understood. Tommy nodded, stepping into the room. He felt awkward in such a nice space. He turned to Mr. Anderson. I understand. I will not go anywhere. Mr. Anderson handed Tommy a small notepad from the desk. Here's the hotel's contact information. If you need it, I'll be next door making some calls. I need to arrange the legal stuff. Call the clinic again and see if we can get you some clothes. Check the closet. There might be a robe or something until we can buy proper clothes. Tommy looked at the closet door. I will, thank you. He paused, unsure if he should say more. Mr. Anderson, the man raised an eyebrow. Yes. Tommy swallowed, feeling shy. I know I keep saying thank you, but I do not know what else to say. You saved us, I mean, my grandmother and me without you. He trailed off, not wanting to think about that scenario. Mr. Anderson's expression softened slightly. You did what you had to do. You asked for help. I just happened to be the one who listened. Do not worry about repaying me or anything like that. Just follow through, do what's needed. And let's get your grandmother better, and you back on track. Tommy nodded. I will. He set the notepad on the desk, glancing around the room again. It felt surreal, but he trusted that things would only get better from here. Mir Anderson stepped back into the hallway. Rest a bit, I'll call the clinic and find out more details about the surgery schedule. I'll also call my lawyer when I have updates. I'll let you know tomorrow morning. We'll go see your grandmother. Tommy watched him go, the connecting door closing softly. He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress felt soft and clean. He took a deep breath, thinking about how this day started in the diner, with fear and desperation. Now he was in a safe place. His grandmother in proper care, and a future plan forming. He knew it would not be easy, but at least he was not alone anymore. He reached for the remote, turned on the TV to some quiet channel and lay back. He kept the phone number of the clinic and Mr. Anderson's contacts in mind. If he needed anything, help was just next door. He finally allowed himself to relax, knowing that tomorrow he would see his grandmother in a safe place, free of pain. And that was worth everything he had gone through.